Hey there, and welcome back to the Great Outdoors Photography Podcast. I'm your host, Brent Bergherm, and this episode, oh man, it's a long time coming. I recorded this conversation I had with Nickolas Warner back in January of this year, 2023. And here it is, Thursday, March 9, for episode 158 of the Great Outdoors Photography Podcast. And I also have a bit of, I guess, an announcement, or I don't know if it's best to call this an announcement or not, but whatever. That is a discount on Breathing Color. And I contacted them. If you're not familiar with Breathing Color, they manufacture excellent papers for making just awesome prints and canvas and stuff like that. And I've also used their varnish, and their varnish is amazing too. I love that with their fine art papers. And I wanted to do a whole episode just on these things. But time being what it is and how it's just gotten away from me, I'm really behind on this because we have a discount code for all you listeners out there. But unfortunately, at the time frame that this is getting out there, you've only got like 2 days left to use it. So there's a huge time constraint here, but it's worth 15% off. So if you go to breathingcolor.com and then it's BC, this is the discount code, by the way. And it's going to sound a little weird, so bear with me. BCLATPOD 15. So BC Lat Pod 15. For some reason, they included, the Lat Pod, I assume, from the former name, the previous name of this show, which was Latitude Photography Podcast. And I didn't tell them anything about that. I don't know where this came from. I decided not to worry about it since it ends, I believe it's March 11, is when this discount code ends. But for anything in their store, 15% off, it should be good for. I'm not getting paid by them to do this. This is just, I said, look, I really like what you guys got. If you're willing, I would just like to be able to share this with all y'all listeners and just have some kind of benefit for you. And that's what this is really all about. So, yes, I have definitely tried their Optica 1 and their Pura Smooth papers. These are some of their fine art papers where the varnishes are going to go really good on. And then I have some of their photo papers I have yet to actually try. And I'm hoping I can get to that either during the spring break or sometime during spring quarter. Definitely during spring quarter, because I'm going to utilize it in one of my classes here at the university. But as it relates to what you guys can do to get yourself a discount, BC Lat Pod 15, go ahead and use that up. Hopefully you can use that up and it will benefit you to test out either some canvas, test out some paper. This is good just directly on their website. If you're an international listener, they have some resources listed on their website about how to buy their stuff locally. But as it relates to using this discount code, it's only available on their actual website, which is breathingcolor.com. A few other things, just trying to, catch up with you a little bit, trying to inform you a little bit, and how things are going. We're almost into test week at the university, which is nice. I'll finally be able to come up for some fresh air a little bit. I was doing a special project, doing some magazine design for an organization, actually my church organization, for all of the Pacific Northwest, which included Alaska and then the rest of the Pacific Northwest here. And so it's just a news magazine kind of thing. And that project is done. It was a short-term project to cover they were between designers. And so that's taken up a considerable amount of my time, and looking forward to being able to also get out on the farm and plant some of those seeds. In a somewhat recent episode, I talked about all the different flowers that we'd be doing and the idea of trying to get some flowers planted for some great photography, some great flower photography. And so this spring break, I'm going to spend a lot of time digging up the ground and getting a whole bunch of ground ready. Not going to plant much yet. We've got some in the greenhouse that are going, some echinacea, some gomphrena, and the straw flower. We started those. It's recommended those get started in the greenhouse a little earlier. And so we've started those, and those should be popping up, sprouting here soon. And then I just look forward to photographing that whole process and photographing that whole growth of these flowers. I'm not going to get time lapse, I don't think, of any of these things. That's going to take a little more time than I have available to do. But just kind of taking my photography in a slightly different. I've done flowers before, and I'm just, as far as what I'm going to grow, though, that's something that is completely new to me. Photographing something that I've grown and nurtured from the seed up, kind of a thing. Now that part is all brand new to me, and so I'm looking forward very much to doing that. Well, let's get on with our conversation with Nickolas Warner. Boy, howdy, this has been so inspiring to me, and I hope it's inspiring to you too. So without any further commentary from me, we're just going to hand it over to this conversation between me and Nickolas Warner about the fantastic and beautiful nation that is Oman. Today, I'm joined by Kirk Keyes, and we're talking about shooting the moon. Kirk, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brent. How's it going?
Going really well. Thank you for being here and talking with us about photographing this wonderful thing we always see in the sky, as long as it's not cloudy and anyway, but the moon, of course. And it is something that I got to tell you, I don't shoot it that frequently, but the times where I have photographed it, it's the kind of thing where I'm really glad I've practiced it, and I'm really glad that I've been able to understand some of these basic ideas that we're going to be talking about, so that when I have that right time and I have that right subject, that foreground subject, and all these other things, they just kind of fall into place, then the photo just falls into place. So we're going to try and help listeners get that idea going to say, hey, here's the things we need to be thinking about, and here are the things that will help us have some success when we're going for photographing the moon. So tell us, Kirk, why do you like photographing the moon?
Well, I grew up during the 60s as a little kid watching the moon launches and the race to space and people walking on the moon. Sorry, flat earthers, if that's news to you. But anyway, so the moon's, like you said, when you see it, it's awesome. It always brightens my day whenever I see the moon. I was just driving home down the street and I saw like the quarter moon rising right over my house as I'm driving down the street. And it's like, nice. Yeah, there it is.
Nice.
So a lot of my photography involves going out and trying to capture the moon rising over different locations, and sometimes even just the moon up in the sky all by itself. It's fun to go take pictures and try to come away with a nice, clean, crisp image. And so I've kind of put together a guide on how to shoot the moon and get better photos.
Yeah, and certainly we've had you on before where we're talking about shooting basically the galactic core, the Milky Way and the galactic core and things like that. And so really this is kind of an extension, I guess we could say, of just this type of shooting the heavens, shooting the celestial presences. But of course, the moon, it's so close comparatively, is so large comparatively. Yeah. And so there are just some of these differences that we're going to need to be thinking about. One of the things that I always kind of revert to, one of the first things in my early photographing of just studying photographs and, interests and all this stuff, of course, is Ansel Adams' certainly very intriguing, very captivating image, Moonrise over Hernandez, New Mexico. Uh-huh. And that's highlighted in his autobiography, or not his autobiography. What's the PBS
it shows
special.
It shows up in anything to do with Ansel Adams. That's probably one of his distinctive shots.
Very distinctive, but the where they were looking at a retrospective of his life, basically for the PBS special. That's the one I'm trying to think about. But anyway,
yeah, I forget what they call that one. So
they go into great detail, and they've got photographer John Sexton talking about it, and certainly there was a challenge because of just the way that it came together for him with the timing. He couldn't find his meter and things like that, but he still got a very captivating, very well rendered image. And I remember seeing that, a print of that in the flesh when I was at a museum in or about Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I think I just stayed there for like easily 15 minutes, just staring at this image, not going around looking at anything else. I didn't expect this image to be there. I'm just like, oh, let's see what they got. And all of a sudden, I was just like, whoa, this was back when I was in college. I was like, whoa, this is pretty intense. And that has just stuck with me. So whenever anything about the moon comes up, my mind instantly goes back to that image. And then I've seen that documentary about his life and his work. And so then I get a little more detail about it. I've also read his books where he then talks about in detail about his images. And yeah, when I come up to that one, just getting into all the nitty gritty details and just like, there's something here. This is pretty amazing.
Yeah. I've actually seen a print of that as well. There was a collection of Ansel's work that came to Portland about 20 years ago, I think.
Wow.
And they had both an early version of that print from like, I think the 50s and then one from like the late 70s, 80s. And the earlier version is like much more sepia toned. It's a
interesting
lower contrast.
Sure.
And somewhere in there in like the late 60s or early 70s, he decided that he needed more contrast in the sky. And so he actually selenium toned the negative, just half of the negative to build more contrast in one part of the image so that it would be easier to print and he could make a more contrasty, more dramatic image. And if you had video, you could see right behind my shoulder, there's a Ansel Adams Tetons and
the
Snake River overlook photo. So Ansel's a big influence. And you mentioned John Sexton. I've actually got a Ansel limited edition, whatever they call the posthumous printed prints that John Sexton does. I have one of the moon coming up over Yosemite Valley that I bought.
Wow. Nice.
And I actually have a print. I went to John's house about 20 years ago and bought a picture of the moon that he has with just the moon and like a thundercloud and a black sky behind it. And that I love shots like that. So I'm always constantly trying to find opportunities to make a photo like that for myself, just because that's it's a captivating photograph for me. And I'm always trying to chase one of those.
Fantastic. Well, we'll get started with some ideas on our camera equipment and other things to support it and things like that. So tell us about either what you shoot or, maybe certainly we need to broaden this out so people can understand the type or the genre of camera or what we're looking for as a base model for getting reasonable images when we're trying to photograph the moon.
Well, one nice thing about the moon is it's relatively bright. It's almost as bright as just daylight on Earth. The exposure value it takes to get the moon recorded is real similar to a daytime exposure, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So actually, any camera that you think is good for your regular landscape photography is probably going to be great for taking photographs of the moon. It's not dim like Milky Way stuff or night sky stuff, so you don't really need a super low noise sensor. Any camera that does great with regular photography will probably take great photos of the moon.
Well, and for me, because there's different ways, of course, you can photograph the moon, but I really appreciate those opportunities, like we were just talking about with that Ansel Adams image. But when you can incorporate the landscape with the moon, and certainly that's where we're talking about, like you said, just whatever image, whatever camera you've got that you're happy with, that you're photographing anything you got going on with your normal stuff when you're shooting the great outdoors, it's just like, this is also going to work for the moon. So if you wanted to get further into doing things like the Milky Way, that's where you might start to think, well, what are some of my things that I want to be concerned about with dynamic range or just a host of things, noise, things like that. But yeah, for the moon, you're really not as, I guess, technically challenged when it comes, the threshold is much more common, I guess we could say.
Sure. And Actually, I kind of look at moon photographs in kind of two, maybe three classes. I mean, telephoto and non-telephoto.
Sure.
The longer your lens, the bigger the moon is, the more impressive it looks in the shot. And there's a definite appeal to that kind of photo. But like the one, that moonrise over Hernandez, I think he took that with like a normal lens. And the moon is small in the image, but it certainly adds a real flair to that shot that it wouldn't have been the same image without having the moon up in the corner of that picture. So as far as lenses go, pretty much any lens you have will do. You can shoot wide angles, you can shoot telephotos. You don't need super fast lenses. You don't need to have like f1.4s or 2.8s even. Your regular kit lens could probably do a great shot given the right composition. So don't really sweat going out and buying the fastest, most expensive piece of glass you can get, unless you're going to go for a really long telephoto lens, and then there's big trade-offs in the benefits for faster lenses, zoom lenses, single focal lengths at that point also.
Yeah, and your quality of glass will be more evident possibly in a shot like this. You know, I've photographed it with the Canon EF 100 to 400, and when you're zoomed out, that's at f5.6. Certainly that's a fairly high quality lens, and it's come out great. The biggest thing you got to worry about is just when you're zoomed in that far, you can actually see the moon transiting across your frame. Yeah. And you have to think about that as well. It's just like, okay, now I need a fast enough shutter speed to make sure that that motion is not going to just turn into a streak. And like you mentioned, it's so bright, you don't really need a long exposure at all in order to get a decent, exposure of the moon itself. In fact, when I'm trying to blend whatever is in the foreground with the moon, oftentimes I'm finding myself doing a couple of exposures so I can do exposure blending because the moon is just overexposed so often. Yeah. And when you're trying to balance that out. So that's just another thing to just as we're planning it out, as we're thinking about it. If you want to zoom in, if you want to incorporate, there is a lot of light coming from that reflected off of that surface of that moon for sure. Yeah. And I always try to catch my images to where the moon is not getting too bright above the landscape, just because, I'm not really a big fan of using Photoshop and image blending. I like to capture stuff in a single frame a lot of times, hold as much as possible.
For me shooting 4x5 film for years and years. And it's like, I was used to having, 5 stops of exposure latitude or exposure range to capture everything. And that's like, I still have that mentality. So, so lenses, pretty much anything you have, although long lenses are a lot of fun with the moon. So a thing that can help with that is teleconverters. Some telephoto lenses you can add teleconverters to. You lose a little sharpness a lot of times, but sometimes, for the composition, if the composition works, if the image is right, nobody's really going to care that much about it being just a little bit less sharp than a non-teleconverter image.
Well, and even with that 1 to 400, and I've got the 2X on there, I think is what I was able to do. I'm still not cropping in on the moon itself. It still fills the frame, or has a lot of frame around it. Yeah. So to really think about, I'm going to fill the frame with this thing, and you need a super long lens to fill the frame with that moon for sure.
You know how nerdy I am. I was actually calculating that the other day, and it's around 2,500 millimeters is what it takes to make the moon be one frame high on like a full frame camera. Wow. So anything less than that's going to be just fractions of a frame. But I find anything like 500, 600, 800 millimeters, the moon's really getting big, and it's a dominant feature in any of those focal lengths. So I kind of break it up into like, wide angle lenses, 35 and less. Medium, like 35 up to say 85. And then I kind of think of like a short telephotos from like 135 up into like 300 millimeters, maybe 200. And anything above 300, the moon's starting to become a dominant feature of the photograph with those focal lengths. So as you think about images you want to make or use like a planning app like Planet or Photo Pills or Photographer's Ephemeris, keep that in mind as far as how big you want the moon to be in your image as to what focal length you're going to need to achieve that.
And certainly we're looking for as sturdy of a tripod as possible. I don't think we want to encourage, I don't know that I would want to try hand holding it anyway. You're still going to be in the neighborhood of maybe a half a second, quarter of a second I would think a minimum on these things. So I think we're going to want to be tripod mounting this. And then I know you're not a fan of ball heads either.
Yeah, I prefer 3-weight gear heads just because you can make an adjustment in each axis of the camera. And I like to frame stuff up exactly how I'm going to have the final crop in the image if I can.
Right.
So I really go for that. And having horizons tipping to one side, it really bugs me. So I try to fix that all in camera.
Yeah, I have... Well, certainly with a pan tilt head, I'm trying to think if I've ever used a gear head. I don't know that I've used a gear head, but I can certainly see the advantage to that when you're dealing with either heavy equipment or something that's a little more precise, like you want to be on this.
Yeah.
Although even with your average scene, you know, when you're trying to level up the scene, you're trying to work, even if especially maybe if you're trying to work a macro scene, I could see that gear head really being a huge benefit.
Oh yeah. And people that shoot architecture love them. For like night photography where you may not be able to see anything through your camera. You take an image, you check your framing, you can twist one of the axes on the 3-way gear head and move the camera exactly where you want it to go without affecting the other 2 axes. And I find it really fast and easy to set stuff up as opposed to always fiddling with the ball head because I just never get it framed up exactly how I want for the ball head. So, but tilt pans are great too. You just don't have the gear. You just have to loosen, adjust, and then tighten again. So it's really similar and a lot less expensive too. Yeah,
where the ball, of course, you loosen it and every axis is going, it's all floppy.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that totally, sometimes it is annoying. So something about the idea of, you know, triggering. So a cable release or some kind of remote is going to be a good idea for us, but you also recommend an intervalometer. Tell us about that.
So because you're often using longer lenses, every time you touch the camera, you're more likely to induce some motion or vibration. So either use your self-timer for shooting with long lenses or use either a wired or a wireless shutter release. Or a lot of times, I shoot a lot of times with like 2, maybe 3 cameras. And so I'll just have one camera framed up and say I'm getting a moonrise coming up over the landscape. I'll have the camera aiming right where I want the framing. I know the moon's going to travel through the image at a certain spot, and I'll just turn the camera on and let it shoot shots every, 5-10 seconds, depending on what the focal length is. So you can get away with not having to touch your camera using an intervalometer like that.
Yeah, and my camera has a built-in intervalometer, and when they started doing that, I was like, oh, so much easier.
Yeah, it is nice, huh?
Depending on which device you get, it gets programmed in a different way, and it's just like, is this really how I want it set? And you have to, a little bit of a headache sometimes, but
for sure.
Since it's built in, there's now just one method to learn, because, I don't know, I had at least 3 different intervalometers over the years, and each one is just a little bit different in how you set it up.
They can get confusing.
Yeah.
Even ones that look the same, similar button layouts, be totally different programming on them. So, yeah, I just don't use those. I use a little fancier intervalometers than that. But So another thing you can do is use polarizing filters.
Yeah, I'm almost surprised to see a recommendation of a polarizer here. So tell me about that, because otherwise I'm just thinking, you're just taking out 2 stops of light.
Yeah, that's true. But we're shooting probably in the daytime with a polarizer. There's little need for it at night, and generally you don't need it around sunrise or sunset. So if you are trying, like today when I saw the moon coming up, half moon, quarter moon, whatever you want to call it, it was right around noontime, and a polarizer would help give a little bit extra saturation to the sky by dialing in the polarizer. It's not going to be that great next to the horizon. As the moon climbs up a little higher in the sky, it's going to help a little more, but it can help increase the contrast in situations like that. But it's kind of a limited use, and really about the only filter you would probably want to use for moon photography.
Right. And then some lens hoods or you call it a dew heater. So help us understand what you mean there.
So if you're shooting at nighttime, a lot of times you can have humidity, condensation on your lens. If you put a lens hood on, you're less likely to get that directly onto your lens. It may collect on the hood. And a dew heater is something that they came up with for telescopes, to keep telescopes the front element warmer than the ambient air, so that they don't collect moisture at night also, because you'll just be shooting and at some point all your pictures just start going blurry. Like I've shot a couple of lunar eclipses, and get to a certain point and it's like, why is everything looking so hazy and low contrast? And it's like, it's because it's starting to dew up on the front. So you can add a dew heater, which usually they're USB powered, run with a 5-volt battery. So it's something you can add to help shoot further into the night. So, and then along with that, a star tracker, like you said, with your 400 millimeter, when you dial in on the moon, it's actually really noticeable how fast the moon goes. And depending on your shot, if you're shooting landscapes, you probably don't want to use the tracker. But if you're going to be shooting zoomed in on the moon, like, I don't know if you've seen any of those like mineral moon photographs that people do, where they've kind of boosted the color saturation in the moon to pick up some of the really faint differences in color of the moon.
I think so, yeah.
So it's kind of a cool look. It really gives like a different look to a moon photograph, full moon photograph, or generally, near full moon. And,
if you get it perfectly aligned, which can be a challenge, there's a huge learning curve here. Mm-hmm. But if you get it perfectly aligned, certainly you can extend your exposure time on the moon, because this thing is literally tracking at the speed that the moon is traveling across your sky. And I remember I did this once, not with the moon, but with the Milky Way. Mm-hmm. And I was nearly perfectly aligned. So when I had several minutes of exposure, I could see there's still a little bit of streak because it's not quite perfect. But when I got in the neighborhood of 30 seconds to a minute, I was still just fine. And I really liked that because it allows you to get super low ISO comparatively what you would use otherwise. Yeah. And you've just got a really super quality raw image there. Certainly if you've got a foreground subject, nope. Your foreground will be blurry. So you're going to have to work in Photoshop then if you're going to go that route. But like you mentioned here, especially helpful if you have the zoomed in effect with your super long lenses. This is something that even if you don't go with that longer exposure, it just keeps you from having to recalibrate and reset your where you're pointing your lens, because it'll just follow it along.
Yeah, because you're going to be constantly adjusting, and especially if you're back to the ball head, you're going to be just fighting the whole night trying to get the moon in the frame to capture the image that you really want to get. And like, what was it, last May, April, whenever, a couple months ago, we had a total lunar eclipse, and it was just clouded out here in the Northwest. And I thought, well, what the heck?
Yeah.
I'll go out and try and see what I can get. The totality was like 3:30 in the morning. I woke up at like 1:45, looked out the window, saw some clear patches of sky. So I had everything all sitting at the back door, hauled it out in the backyard. I could not see the North Star to do a alignment for the tracker. So I used a compass to get the tracker generally towards the North Star, towards north.
Yeah.
And then I know my latitude, so that was already set. And I framed up the moon with the tracker, and I was able to take, what were they, 6-second exposures during totality when the moon would pop through the clouds for just like a couple of seconds. And,
Wow.
and that was another instance of having the intervalometer handy, because I had the moon framed up. The tracker was following the moon. I just needed enough clear sky to get a shot of the moon. And it was like cloudy almost that entire time during totality. But at one point it opened up enough that even with just a tiny bit of haze, I was still able to get a nice shot of the moon that,
Sweet.
would have been impossible to get without those other tools to help me along. So
very cool. And so as far as setting up our cameras, we've got some ideas here that we're going to be recommending people consider using. And our first one certainly is to photograph in RAW.
Yeah. You just mentioned a second ago about shooting in RAW. It's like, always shoot in RAW. If you want to do RAW plus JPEG, go ahead, but that's on your SD card or compact flash card, not mine. So always shoot RAW. And then generally you're going to want to shoot manual exposure, just because your camera meter can get fooled. If you got matrix metering, maybe it'll pick it up, but it's going to want to make the moon, average gray, 50% gray or 18% gray, depending on how you look at it these days. That is if the metering mode even picks up the moon. If you're like center weighted or something, or spot metered, you may just miss the moon and just blow your exposures and waste a lot of time with trying to get your meter to work properly. For daytime shots, a lot of times metering works just fine, because the moon's just similar brightness to the daytime, and it's part of the scene, so it's going to work out really great. But once it starts getting dark, you're going to want to be metering or exposing manually. And then autofocus, you might want to use autofocus if you have a camera that can really focus on the moon well, and then turn it off just so that your camera doesn't go searching every time you go to take a picture. But I usually, if I do the autofocus, I'll get it close, and then I'll manually try to tweak it in just a tiny bit closer. And with really long lenses, it really is tough. Like I have like the Sony's 200 to 600 millimeter lens, and sometimes I'll shoot at 1200 millimeters on a crop sensor, so it's like even bigger. And just touching the camera makes the moon just bounce around, and it's near impossible to focus with that kind of situation. So you gotta use a light touch and just be as gentle as you can as you're trying to focus. And the next thing I recommend is live view. Even if you're like a DSLR, if you have a live view feature, I would recommend using that. And then also, if your camera has live view setting effects, so that it actually shows you what your exposure is going to look like while you're in live view, go ahead and turn that on, because that's next to a histogram. That's like your best tool, I think, for determining whether you have a good exposure.
Yeah, once you're used to what your screen looks like, for sure. Right. And also, you're going to probably be either making your screen brighter or darker. So there's going to be some variables there that we want to get used to. But that's why you also have the next thing, if you have the blinkies options or the zebras, to help you understand if you are overexposing, i.e. these areas that are blinking on your live view playback, those are going to be items that are rendered pure white. And so we want to make sure we're not lifting it so far to the exposure. We're not lifting it so far where the moon is just getting pure white. I say bring it down about maybe 2/3 of a stop from that. And when you bring it into Lightroom, your peak on your spike on the histogram I like to have it spike right in that neighborhood, right between where the highlights slider has an effect and the whites slider has an effect.
Mm-hmm.
When you mouse over those sliders in Lightroom and you look at your histogram, you'll see these are the regions. These are the areas of the histogram that these sliders have a predominant effect over. And when you can have it spike and split the difference, you can then more easily split the difference in post-production too. Maybe bring the whites slider up a little bit, the highlights slider down a little bit. And whenever you spread your histogram like that, you're increasing contrast and you're going to then increase the perceived detail of what you captured in the moon. So that's something that, as far as your exposure is concerned, practice for sure. But that's going to be, at least initially, if we're shooting in the dark of night, that's going to be my practice anyways. I should put that under there too, because if you're shooting in the evening or the early morning and you're getting moonrise or moonset, whatever the case is, certainly you've got ambient light. You've got to think about that too. That is not what I've been talking about. I've been talking about if you're just shooting plainly the moon and it's really dark, past that blue hour kind of a thing. That's where I would want to make sure I place the exposure for the moon.
Yeah, I like that little tip about aiming for where your Lightroom kind of affects the midpoint between highlights and whites, because a lot of times the full moon does look kind of flat just because of the angle of the sunlight hitting the moon bouncing straight back towards us actually has a flattening effect on the surface of the moon. So,
yeah, especially if it's a full moon, because we're basically on the same exact axis as the sun. And so it doesn't have that much of an angle, where if it's a half moon, you have a completely different angle that you're getting. So you're going to see some shadows along the shadow edge and whatnot, the shapes and whatnot of the subjects of the moon, the craters and whatnot. So yeah, if you're full moon, yeah, you're right. It just naturally has a flattening effect. Yeah.
And so that's my basic recommendations. There's a few other things you can do, but we'll save that for another day.
In fact, our next thing, though, is talking about basics of exposure. And so we've probably already covered some of these types of items for this outline that you've created for us, which I haven't mentioned it yet, but the show notes for the website, you'll see this whole outline. You'll be able to follow along. Maybe you want to print it off or something like that, copy and paste it or whatever the case is, so you can have it for your own reference later. But yeah, when we're talking about these ideas of what is a proper exposure, I mean, we've already given some ideas for that nature of when it's, virtually pitch black out there, but what about some other ideas for proper exposure?
Well, we talked about the contrast that's there. A lot of times the moon can be way brighter than the scene.
Yeah.
And so that's a consideration. You may need to do other things like HDR effects or, pasting, the moon from a lower exposure into a brighter background.
Right.
One thing you can also think about is maybe plan ahead and maybe capture the moon the day before so that it's not in the sky when the sky is quite so dark or the landscape is quite so dark. So
we're talking about cheating now.
Cheating, planning ahead, not being spontaneous in your photography.
That's right.
There's benefits to both.
That's all right. Yeah, that's all right. So, no, I'm not going to give you too much of a hard. I'm just giving you a hard time. What I'm most interested in, though, like you said, if you plan ahead, and that's the whole point. You're planning it. It's your creation. It's your vision that you're able to bring to fruition. By all means, let's make that happen.
Yeah. So, let's maybe skip down to the section for determining our exposure settings. The one thing to always think about is, like we mentioned, the moon is always moving. So when I go to shoot the moon, I kind of think about it in shutter speed first, then aperture, and then my ISO. So I'm going to pick a shutter speed that's going to capture the motion of the moon or freeze the motion of the moon or blur the motion of the moon, depending on what I want. That's going to be my first consideration. Then the next thing I'm going to try to figure is my aperture, and I'm going to use that to control the depth of field and or sometimes to help make the lens be a little sharper by stopping down at least a stop or maybe 2 stops sometimes, depending on the situation. If it's starting to get dark, you're probably not going to be shooting at f8 and capturing a sharp moon at the same time once it starts to get dark. But and then I'll use ISO to set the overall exposure of the image. If I can use ISO 100, I'll go for 100. If I need to raise the ISO because the exposure is just getting too dark with the shutter speed and the aperture that I have. Because also, like I said, even though you don't need fast lenses for moon photography, the problem with a lot of telephoto lenses is they're not very fast lenses.
Right.
So you may be starting at f4 or 5.6 or f8 even, and so you're kind of limited in that respect with longer telephotos. So I generally try to think about whether I want the moon sharp in the image, and so then I'll determine what my shutter speed is, and longer focal length lenses are going to need shorter exposure times than shorter focal length lenses. If you're shooting wide angles, you can go many seconds before the moon's going to start to blur. So it's not that big of an issue with those. But generally, people in the past were considering shutter speeds. You've probably heard of the 500 rule.
For sure.
It's designed for stars, but designed for stars on film. And so it really doesn't work all that great nowadays for digital sensors. But anyway, it was you took the focal length of your lens, you took 500, divided it by your focal length, and that was your exposure time in seconds. And if you're like a 500 millimeter lens, that would give you like a 1 second exposure, which that could be okay depending on your situation. There's variations on the 500 rule. People had 600, 400 on down the line, trying to get more sharpness or maybe less sharpness depending on what their situation is. I've run across the guy that came up with a rule of 4 that he designed for using with telephoto lenses. And so you just take 4 and divide it by your focal length, and that'll give you a much shorter exposure than the 500 rule. But it may also be a shorter time than you actually need for photographing the moon. But let's take our 500 millimeter lens. We would have 4 divided by 500. I think that's what, 0.8 seconds?
0.008 is what I'm getting.
Oh, there you go. That's right. So around 100th of a second, if I remember right.
Yes, 8,000ths of a second. So if I'm reading it's 0.008 because 0.08 would be 800ths of a second.
Yeah.
So yes, we're just shy of 1/100th of a second.
Yeah. So, and actually we'll see in a few seconds here that could actually be a good starting place. Nowadays people use the NPF rule for sharp stars, and that can actually work if you're doing longer exposures where you're going to get motion of the sky, like with wide angle lenses, but you're probably going to want shorter times than what the NPF rule gives also. And so all those rules really only talk about focal length and not exposure. So you can kind of use them as guidelines for how long a shutter speed you can use for a certain focal length of lens. But as far as calculating exposure, if you've been doing photography from the old film days, you may be familiar with something called the Sunny 16 rule.
Sure.
Someone came up with the Looney 11 rule, which I love the name for that, Looney 11. And
this is the first time I've actually heard of this, so
really?
This is interesting.
Well, you know Sunny 16, right?
Yes, you bet.
Okay, so Sunny 16 means at f16, your shutter speed would be 1 over your film speed. So
your
if you're
ISO,
shooting
right.
ISO 100, you would have 1 over 100 be your shutter speed, so 100th of a second at ISO 100 and f16.
If it's a bright, sunshiny day outdoors.
If it's a bright, sunshiny day outdoors.
Yes.
So the thing to remember is, on the surface of the moon, it's always a bright, sunny, sunshiny day.
I suppose that's true.
The catch is the moon's about half as bright as an average day on Earth during those conditions. So to make up for that, you open up the lens one stop. You go from 16 to 11. And so you get the Looney 11 rule. So you set your lens to f11. You set your ISO to whatever it is, say 100, and then your shutter speed will be 1 over that ISO. So you would have 100th of a second for ISO 100 at f11. So, and that exposure should give you, it should capture the detail on the moon and capture it in a proper range for your camera's exposure range. So, like you say, that's a starting point. So your conditions are always going to be your final decider. And also not only are some lenses not letting in as much light, or as one lens at say f5.6 versus another lens at f5.6, the ISO speed that some manufacturers use also shifts around a little bit. So you've got two things at play there that are going to be working against you. So that's a guideline. So take a shot at Looney 11 and then either drop your shutter speed or change your f-stop or change your ISO. Do whatever it takes to get you back into that sweet spot for the moon.
To dial it in where you need it, yep.
And one thing about histograms, even when you're shooting with like a long telephoto, so the moon is a reasonably prominent feature in the image. Like if you have black background around the moon, your histogram is going to be this big lump over on the left-hand side, and then it's going to drop down to near zero. Right. And you may have to get a magnifying glass out to see the blip for where the moon is on your histogram. So when you're trying to dial the moon into that sweet spot, like Brent was just talking about 3/4 of the way over, a quarter of the way from the right-hand side, you may have to look really carefully, and you may have to take another exposure just to see if that blip moves one way or the other.
Absolutely right. Yep.
It's so hard to see the moon in a histogram a lot of times.
Yeah. Now that's certainly if the moon is pretty small. If you were to zoom in on the moon and you've got a 300 to 500 millimeter, whatever, you'll probably see at least a little bit of a blip. It's not going to be microscopic.
It's still not all that. You would think it would be bigger, but it's oddly it's not. So
you still have a lot of detail there for that region because the histogram is just giving you a sense for the quantity of these values, the quantity of these brightness or darkness values. It's not giving you the notion of the quality of what you're recording. So if you're looking at it and you're like, I don't have much of a blip there. It's like, of course you don't, because you don't have much in that bright area, in that brightness value. There's just not much of a quantity of that brightness value. So yeah, it's still there and it's still important, but you're right. If you can't see it, that can certainly be a challenge. And this is where your blinkies are going to really help. Mm-hmm. Whether you, because like for my camera, I just have it do it when I hit the play button. It'll blink at me if I've got an overexposed area and it's going gangbusters crazy with the blinky. Mm-hmm. So that's where you can then say, okay, I know that area is overexposed, and I'll just keep bringing it down a third of a stop until that goes away. And then I would feel comfortable still going 1/3 stop more, make sure I get both those, then I can make a decision in post-production as to which one is the better starting point. Yeah.
A lot of times I have that turned on since I'm shooting a Sony, it's live view. I have that on before the exposure. And so I can keep track, because a lot of times I'll be doing time lapses. And so I want to know if part of the image is actually getting too bright to be recorded well. So
good point.
And a lot of times you can pull down the stop without too much issue with modern cameras, but you can also add 2 or 3 stops exposure a lot of time without really hurting the shadows that much. So if you're going to, err one direction or the other, err slightly on the side of underexposure rather than overexposure when you're doing shots of the moon where it's the brightest thing in the image.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
But So if you're shooting with wide angle lenses, you're going to see hardly any detail on the surface of the moon, if any. It may just be a bright blob up in the sky. And you can actually get away with longer shutter speeds because there's not going to be a lot of detail up there to actually record. So you may be able to shoot up to 30 seconds with a wide angle lens. And then for normal to short telephotos, you're going to have a little more detail. You're going to start seeing detail generally around 70 or 100 millimeters. It's going to be, obvious in the picture. And so probably not too much longer than a second for images with a medium to short telephoto lens. And once you start getting above that 200-300 millimeter focal length, you're going to have lots of detail visible on the moon. And you're going to need some shorter focal lengths to capture that. So those are kind of just the basic guidelines I use. So the next thing
I'm intrigued by this because we have some facts coming out. And I love it because you're saying understanding how the moon moves. So basically how it behaves as it goes about the Earth. That helps us learn about its tracking and its behavior and such, and helps us make better pictures. So help us understand what we're dealing with here. Yeah.
So the moon moves around the Earth every 29 and a half days. And as it does that from day to day, it's going to move about 15 degrees eastward across the sky. And that means it's going to rise and set about 50 minutes later each day than the previous day. And over the course of one day, as long as you're in mid-latitudes or around the equator, it sets about 12 hours after it rises. I mean, you can be up near the North Pole or South Pole, and it's going to be up for weeks at a time at some points of the year. So don't count those regions there. But
well, that's a good rule of thumb, though. Rises about 50 minutes later each day.
Yeah. So
because there's something I know. I've been looking at the moon one day and I'll be like, I know tomorrow is going to be later, but I've never known that exact. Well, it's not exact. It's about, but that rough neighborhood of how much longer. Okay. If it's 7:00 now, it'll be about 7:50 tomorrow. That's good news to know.
Yeah. And, you may not have your camera ready to go take a picture on that one day, but the next day, if you know it's going to be even closer to sunset or something, or sunrise, now you've got just a basic tool that you can go, okay, well, I need about an hour after this point tomorrow. The moon's going to be in a better spot for a photograph. So just having some of these concepts will make it a little more intuitive. I mean, you can use all these planning apps to calculate to the second when these things are going to happen, but having just a basic knowledge of how the moon moves across the sky is going to help you intuit photos that you can make just inventing them out of your own mind without having to go look stuff up.
Because some of the best images that I've made of the moon are when it's the day before full moon.
Yeah.
So it rises just before the sun sets. So you have low raking light on the landscape. You've got the moon, which almost looks full. You know, if you were to sneeze, you'd say like, "Hey, that's a full moon." And it can just look. It can look really awesome. And then the following day, when you have it, when you're going for moon set. And, you know, just before or right at around sunrise, I mean, there's just a good couple of days of transition right there, where you can get the moon rise coming here at sunset, and then of course 12 hours later, be thinking about moon set, and that can be that can get you some pretty intriguing images as well. I in a workshop last summer in the Palouse area. Oh my goodness, we had the best moonset image ever because it was right in this little valley between these two hills of the Palouse.
Uh-huh.
Then there's this gorgeous set of barns right in the foreground.
Oh, nice.
I mean, it was just, everything just clicked beautifully. It was just amazing. And we've mentioned a couple of times, you've mentioned a couple of times, a couple of apps, PhotoPills and Planet. I'm more familiar with PhotoPills. I think I also have Planet, but I have hardly looked into it. But I was definitely using that app along with some Google Maps, and just, Google Maps first to be like, okay, this might look pretty interesting. Now let's look at it in PhotoPills and see exactly where the angles and whatever else. And then because it'll show you the angles of where it's going to set according to where you have your pin established. And like, hey, if I'm right here on the road, that angle's right there. Those barns are right in the middle of that line. Let's be there and cross our fingers, pray for some clear skies, clear enough skies anyway. And it worked out. It's gorgeous. It was amazing. So yes, get those apps going, understand this idea of this motion of the moon and how that thing behaves, and some serendipity can happen. Absolutely. Yeah,
for sure. And, I mean, your local geography also plays into that too. If you're out in the Midwest and you've got flat land from, 360 degrees around you, you're going to be probably maybe better off on the day of the full moon. It kind of depends, because
good point.
Out west here, where we've got some elevation change,
we almost always have mountains. Yes.
Yeah. I'm in Portland, and I'm shooting like Mount Hood a lot of times, or up the Columbia River Gorge, and there's like 3 or 4 or even 5, 6 degrees before the moon actually clears the horizon. So that day before trick is definitely a good one that I put to use a lot.
Well, and even here, I'm thinking of a place out at Whitman Mission. You can get to the back of it. There's a barn in the field, adjacent field. But then we've got our, what they call Blue Mountains, and they're really molehills. Mm-hmm. But even with that, they are enough to where it's just like, no, you got to go the day before full moon, so you can get that in the right spot, in the right time, and the light is gorgeous on everything. At least when it's springtime and there's wheat in the foreground, it's all beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially like you're talking in the Palouse, those hills aren't all that high, but they're right next to you. So
they are. Yeah, you're in the middle of it.
Angle right there. Yeah. So you may need like the day before the new moon.
Yeah, sometime
to
for
catch
sure.
The moon setting back behind them. So
yep.
That's where all these ideas of understanding how the moon moves from day to day is going to help you be able to intuit where to go and how to get that shot you're looking for, or one that just pops in your head while you're out at a certain location. So,
well, let's talk a little bit about the phases of the moon. You've got a little bit here on the notes about just understanding phases as well. And this is going to intrigue me, because these phases, they're in different positions in the sky as we look through these phases too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, there's standardized names for the phases of the moon based on how much of the moon you actually see. And so the new moon is when the moon is near the sun so that you can't see the moon. It's in the glare of the sun. It's just almost impossible to see unless you do a couple of little tricks to block out the sun so that you can actually see it.
Sure.
But it generally takes like a day or so before you can see a crescent moon appear. And so that next phase is called a crescent, where it's just a little tiny wedge, and that's all the way up until the moon is a quarter, when you see one half of the moon lit. That next day it becomes a gibbous moon, where more than half of the moon is lit, all the way up until the moon becomes full, when the entire surface of the moon is lit. And then it goes backwards in order again. We go back to a gibbous, then back to a quarter, then back to a crescent, and then the lunar month ends with it being a new moon again. So it goes through that progression. There's a term called waxing, which is the moon is increasing in size. So from new moon to full moon, it's called a waxing moon. So you'll have like a waxing crescent, a waxing gibbous moon.
Okay.
And then waning is what they call it, as the moon goes from full back down to new, and waning just means it's decreasing in size. And it takes about a week to move from each of the quarters of the moon. I always get kind of crossed up between, is it a quarter moon or a half moon? Because I see half of the moon, but they call it a quarter moon. So that always blows my mind.
Yeah,
blows
it's
my
a
mind
half
a little
slice
bit.
in the sky, but you're only seeing 25% of the actual surface of the moon.
Right. If it's like a pizza or a pie, that's a half, not a quarter.
You're looking at a half, yeah.
Exactly. So it takes about a week to move from one to the next, and that's another thing you can use. If you see a quarter moon up in the sky today, you know in about a week it's going to be a full moon. So maybe there's some shot you want to go do, and you just noticed that the moon's a quarter now, and you've been wanting to get a new moon or a full moon shot. Well, plan for it in a week, so you don't need to go look at a calendar or anything to figure out when that full moon's going to be. If you see it quarter today, you know it's 1 week in the future. And so again, full moon to a waning quarter, about a week, and another week back to the new moon again.
And of course, the ultimate new moon is when we have the eclipse.
Yep, a total solar eclipse.
Now we're having here somewhat soon an annular eclipse, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to cross Oregon once again. Back in 2017, we had the total solar eclipse.
Yeah.
And that went from the shores of Oregon on down to like Louisiana, I think, or something like that. Or where was it? I forget where.
Somewhere in the Carolinas.
The Carolinas. Okay. So it went across the entire nation.
Yeah.
Well, this time it's an annular eclipse, which means we're going to get a ring of fire kind of look appeal. It's not going to be a complete total blockout, a complete total shading of the sun. So we're going to get a ring of fire. And I've not looked into what the path is for this, for the best path for this. But anyway, I know that's happening soon. When do you know when that is going to be happening?
Yeah. I think it's October 8th.
Oh, so that's a long ways away.
It's a couple of months away. But
that's not
one thing to think about is if you go out and practice photographing the moon between then and now, almost all the techniques that you use as far as setting up your camera and tracking or framing, all that stuff, it's going to apply to photographing the solar eclipse, either that annular eclipse that Brent just mentioned, or there's a total solar eclipse that goes from Texas up into New England in May of 2024.
2024,
so, depending on where you're at in the country, you may be able to catch two solar eclipses within 6 months of each other.
It's too bad that it's in 2024 because, I mean, I'm working then in May.
I know.
Why couldn't it be mid-June or July or something like that? I mean, I would absolutely road trip it to go get that sucker.
Yeah, I've already told my wife I'm going to pack up the Jeep and haul all my camera gear down to Austin, Texas or someplace and set up for that.
Because I absolutely regret not traveling the extra 50 miles or whatever I needed to go in 2017. I got a really nice shot, and I'm hugely proud of my shot that I got because the obelisk at Whitman Mission Memorial is pointing right at the full-on transit where we had 97% coverage. And then I got 15-minute increments on either side. And so then I photoshopped it together. I loved it. It was great, but it's not that full-on thing.
Yeah.
So, if I could figure out a way to get that full-on thing in 2024.
Well, take your classes on a field trip.
Or I could find a conference somewhere too, maybe.
There you go.
Either way.
I'm sure there's going to be a lot of things happening on the path of that eclipse during that time frame. So.
Most likely, yeah.
But so that's one reason to work on your moon photography is for practice for both lunar and solar eclipses.
Yeah, you bet.
So, and because of that, we also, the moon is kind of tied to the path of the sun. So every time there's like a new moon, we know that the moon has to go near the sun. It's actually within about 5 degrees of the sun. And so we know crescent moons are going to follow the path of the rising or setting sun. And that full moons are going to be, think of there being like a stick during full moon that passes from the sun through the earth and out to the moon on the other side. So if the sun is setting in the northwest, that means the moon is going to be rising in the southeast. And that's the condition that we'll have in the summer times in the northern hemisphere. In the winter, the sun will be setting in the southwest, and so the moon will be rising in the northeast. So
that's something I actually noticed this season, as I actually have a bit of property now, and I can go out and spend some time walking the field. And I was just like, wait a second, that the moon's rising way over there. And for some reason, certainly it's one of those things you've known, but it's not something that I've really taken stock of, and just be like, oh, interesting, where I'm really trying to just learn the lay of the land on the new property. I mean, we've been here over 2.5 years now, but still, it's just like, when that epiphany hit me, what was it? Maybe a year ago now. It was like, that's really cool. I like to see that and understand where those are happening and how it's coming about.
Yeah, and actually, if you know where the extent of the sunrise is for your area, the moon is going to be within about 5 degrees of that in, the opposite direction of where the sun is setting. So it's the sun moves up and down like 23 degrees. The moon's going to be within that plus or minus 5 degrees on either side of the sun. It moves through a 18-year cycle. The moon does as to how it goes up and down relative to the sun. So that can also help you intuit where the moonrise is going to be. Like at this time of year, I know moonrises are in the northeast. And so I got to find locations to the southwest to line up with a foreground object to get the moon behind it. In the summertime, it's the other direction. Springtime, fall time, you look for things straight east of where your camera location is, or you put your camera straight west or east of the landscape object that you're looking for.
Interesting.
So there are some best times of the day to shoot each of these phases, like crescent moons, because they happen shortly after the new moon or right before the new moon. They're going to be near the sunsets. So wherever the sun is setting, the moon's going to be following that path, or wherever the sun is going to be rising up, that crescent moon is going to be preceding that path of the sun as it comes up.
For some reason, I just had a little visioning happening in my head.
Yeah.
Because I know if it's the right, if the planets are in the right position anyway, so let's get that assumed. But if you wanted to photograph Venus, you have to photograph it basically within 10 or so minutes after sunset, because it's closer to the sun than we are. And so you're only going to have a little bit of a time frame to where you'd be able to see Venus actually in the night sky.
Right.
How cool would it be to get a Venus and crescent moon together? That'd be pretty sweet, I think.
And that just happened a week ago.
Okay.
Except I was clouded out. It's all last week. It was just like, they kept forecasting like clear skies, but there was always this haze of clouds over here in Portland.
And now we've got bright sun shining. I can see behind you, your window is bright sunshiny. It's been clear all day here on this side of the state. But yeah. And in fact, Saturn was next to Venus last Monday. Oh, even better. The Saturn, Venus, and the moon.
Yeah, and the moon just passed kind of a few degrees away from both of them. And I was like, oh man, I was all set, had the camera all packed, had a location all set, but it was just all cloudy. So
we need another tangent. Are you going to photograph that comet that's going through?
I actually went out last Friday night.
All right.
Went up to Mount Hood. I left the car at 5 p.m. I hiked 2 miles down to a lake on the south side of Mount Hood, and I got the comet passing right behind it actually dipped behind the peak of Mount Hood for a few minutes, and then back out the other side. And
that's awesome.
Except that comet is so tiny.
Really?
Yeah. It's
not like Neowise.
Not like Neowise. It's definitely not like Neowise. It's like even in like 150 millimeter focal length, it still looks tiny.
Oh man!
So it should be better today, which this end of January right now.
Yeah.
But it's going to be getting more moonlight, so it's going to be harder to see for the rest of its pass by. So
That's too bad.
But so I did try.
Yeah, because Neowise, shoot, even on like a 20 millimeter lens, it was still showing quite a decent trail.
It was obvious, huh?
That was nice.
Yeah. Well, you see a little green fuzzy blob on this one. So,
all right.
But
I also have a green brush in Photoshop. I can just go, floop.
There you go.
Maybe that's taking it too many creative liberties.
Well, I'll admit that on my shot, I did like increase the green channel just a little bit right there on that part of the image. So just to draw out some of that green that was already there.
All right, but, let's underail this.
Sure.
This I don't want to call it a train wreck because that was really actually interesting. So anyway, get back on track. You talked about after new moons and before. Did we talk about before the new moon? Where are we at on our list here?
Yeah. So with crescents, they're going to be at the start of the lunar cycle. They're going to be at sunset or shortly after sunset. Well, it's going to take like a day or so before you can actually see the crescent moon. It's got to get far enough away from the sun's haze that you can actually see it. I've gone out and photographed a moon that was only 20 hours old, and I could not actually see it with my eyes, and I just took photographs of the sky, and I can see just the faintest of crescents in the image. I came back the next day where it was 44 hours, almost 2 days old, and it was obviously visible in the sky at that point. So give yourself like a day or two before you go try to take a picture of a crescent moon. But the advantage of getting a crescent moon at that time frame is you're going to have something called earth shine, which is the glow from light reflecting off the surface of the earth, bouncing back up to the side of the moon that's in the shadow from the sun, and it illuminates the moon. And it's just an awesome effect. It's so beautiful. You get the little thin crescent on the one side, and then the back side of the moon is glowing in the sky, filling in that circle that your eye wants to add to the rest of the moon. I mean, that crescent looks cool, but your brain wants to fill it in. Yeah. And that earth shine actually does that for you. Very cool. So it's a cool effect, and my favorite part of catching the crescent moon is trying to get the earth shine in. And to maximize the earth shine, don't worry about the lit part of the crescent blowing out. I mean, because it's such a sliver anyway. There's such a sliver. There's so little detail and so little craters that you can see in that area. Just go ahead and go for the extra exposure. This is where you're going to be wanting to shoot, and you want a telephoto up into the second range so that you can get enough exposure for that earth shine to show up. Next up is like quarter moons. They'll rise around noon and set around midnight for the waxing crescent, or quarter moon. Waning will be rising around midnight and setting around noontime. They're often not that impressive just because they get washed out by the sun and the atmospheric haze, but when they set, they can actually look cool and be interest into a nice landscape photo that you have. It's a little bonus that you can have up in the sky in the landscape. Gibbous moons are kind of passing through that same time frame of being up mostly during the daytime. So kind of move on to like full moons, and like Brent was saying, a lot of times the day before looks better than the day of the full moon. The full moon is going to rise near sunset, and it's going to set near sunrise, and it's going to be opposite direction of the sun. And let's see, one thing about the when you look on a calendar and it says it's a full moon today, you don't really know if that full moon was at 12:01 in the morning or at 11:59 in the afternoon. So when you're looking to shoot for that day before, give yourself a little extra slack, because it may be 2 days before what the calendar says is the full moon. And once you start looking at the moon and noticing the shape of the moon, you'll notice how much of that shadow is visible on the side of the moon, and you can actually pick out like the day before or 2 days before a full moon with a little practice. It does take a little bit of looking and paying attention, but you can just see there's a little haze on the one side of the moon that tells you it's not quite a full moon yet. So,
and I'm glad you put this detail in there as far as when does the true, we'll go ahead and call it that, the true
right.
full moon, the calculated full moon actually happen. Because as you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, what it takes 29 and a half days to make a full...
Right, a lunar month.
A lunar month, thank you. So a full circle around the Earth.
Yeah.
So that just tells us that, from month to month, from time to time, whatever, we're not going to have the calculated full moon always be at our sunset or always be at our, whenever. Yeah. And so the calculated full moon for us could still not quite be exact, where if we were in Japan or China or something like that, it would be more of that quote full moon approach. Mm-hmm. And so there might be slight differences in exactly when we might want to shoot something or when the actual moonrise, moonset might be happening. And so this is where I think, again, I'm going to point to the idea of getting an app so you can really dial these things in as far as timing it and understanding it. We're talking about, hey, in general speaking, a day or two beforehand might work out really well.
Yeah.
This is going to take your experience to get out there in the field, track this thing, experience this thing, and then take notes for your next time, because this is definitely something that will work in your favor when you have that experience that you've already had, and you can then put what you've learned to good use and get hopefully a better experience, better shots moving forward.
Yeah, and PhotoPills and Planet both have functions that you can search for when a full moon rise happens every month, or even like the day before the full moon, and it'll tell you how high the sun is relative to the moon at that point. So as you search through, look for times where the sun is like maybe, below zero or down to like 3 or 4 degrees below the horizon, because what'll happen at that point is there's an effect in the sky called the belt of Venus, and it's also called the girdle of Venus. It kind of, this little band that moves across the sky, starting at the horizon, you'll see this pinkish purplish tone that'll start to rise up as the sun has already set, as the sky starts to darken. And after a little while, you'll see this bluish line below it moving up in the sky as well. And that blue line is the actual shadow of the Earth from the sun as the sun's bending the light through the Earth's atmosphere. So that pinkish purple color, it's kind of related to like alpenglow that you may have heard of shining on the top of mountains. Well, it shines past the mountains and into the Earth's atmosphere and lights up the atmosphere as well. And so if you can time your moonrise to be during that point where the sun is just a few degrees below the horizon, that you get the belt of Venus showing, it makes for awesome photos, because you're going to have like a pink purple background with the moon glowing, and your ground is still going to be fairly lit so that you can get detail in the foreground. And those are like my ideal shots for a moonrise photo.
Absolutely.
Doesn't happen every month. You got to like check the times and do some searching and look around for stuff like that. But ideally, that's my ideal shot.
Cool.
And so
you've got some other terms here, supermoons and micromoons. Is this kind of the idea of what feeds into why in a few months here we're going to have an annular solar eclipse versus a total solar eclipse that we had several years ago, at least in Oregon? That's what I'm talking about. Tell us a little bit about what you got going on here with these terms.
Yeah. So, the moon's orbit around the Earth isn't perfectly circular. It changes with the time of the year as to how close the moon passes between us and the sun, and how close it passes as it goes away from the Earth and the sun. And it can appear larger or smaller based on those. Someone, I think it was like an astrology person, which is not astronomy, different field.
Very different.
Totally bogus, but different field. And anyway, someone came up with the term supermoon to denote when the moon is at the closest approach around the Earth during a full moon. It does actually look larger. And you hear it in the news all the time. It's like, the super worm moon or the super whatever moon.
Boy, they love these different...
I know. All these
I
traditional names.
I want to use the term stupid, but it's probably a little strong.
No, I agree.
Okay.
There's definitely hype and sensationalism involved there.
Yeah.
And these traditional names, it's one thing to think about is, these are names from either Northeast American Indian names combined with Anglo-Saxon names from Old England. And so...
And that's the best combination.
That is like the two best cultural combinations. I mean,
said sarcastically.
Yeah, well, at least the Anglo-Saxon one. Yeah, so every Indian group in the world had a different name pretty much. There's lists online. It's awesome to go look through them and see how culturally relevant each of these names are for the different places in the North and South America as to where these people came up with names.
That would be interesting, yes.
Same with, other cultures, China, India, African cultures. They all have their own names, so I think it's kind of disrespectful to use those names in a way. So, but anyway, the supermoon ties in perfectly because it's another layer of hype that's added on to those culturally not relevant names, I guess. And but the moon does get closer and it does get further away. And like you said, with the annular eclipse, the moon is actually closer to the Earth at that point, so it doesn't quite cover up the moon like it does in a full total solar eclipse. And so the difference is about 7% larger for a supermoon. A micromoon is the other direction where it's smaller. It's about 7% smaller than an average sized moon. And if there's any real difference, the exposure on a supermoon compared to a micromoon is about 30%, which you think of that being significant, but that's still what, 1/3 of a stop? That's not that much actually. So
let me wrap my mind around this just a little bit tighter here, maybe. So you mentioned that, of course, the annular eclipse is when the moon is closer to the Earth.
Right.
So that tells me that...
No, I got that backwards. The moon is further away from the Earth, so it's smaller.
Okay.
Relative in size.
And maybe I heard you wrong. I could go back and replay it. I may have said it
the other way too.
But at least we have it. We have it straight now. So
good catch.
The annular eclipse is when the moon is further away from the Earth.
Yeah.
And so that would also be considered a micromoon type phase. Phase is probably the wrong word, but a micromoon instance. And then when it's closer to the Earth, that's where it appears bigger, and that's where it could have a full total solar happening going on, because that's when it does have a full shade of the sun.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. And it also increases the length of time that the totality happens too.
Sure.
So, same thing happens with lunar eclipses. If the moon's closer, it's going to be more in the shadow of the Earth's shadow, and you're going to get a darker, longer total solar eclipse relative to one that's farther out. So it does have an effect on some things, but for generally taking a picture of a moon, you can't really tell 7% difference. I mean, just as a rule of thumb.
So insignificant, yes.
Yeah, if you take your thumb and stick your arm out and lift your thumb up, that's about the width of the moon in the sky when you go look at it. So it's pretty small, and you can't tell 7% difference looking at your own thumb there. So
no.
And a lot of people also think that the moon is bigger when it's near the horizon than when it is up in the sky. And that is actually an optical illusion, and it doesn't change size. The Earth's refraction will actually, or the atmospheric refraction will actually change the position of the moon and the sun as they get closer to the horizon, but they don't really have that big of an effect on the size of the moon. And they still aren't really sure as to why that effect happens. That's a kind of a cool thing to go look on Wikipedia as to what they think causes that. There's a couple of competing theories, but that's called the moon illusion. So check it out if you're interested in that. So
sweet. So let's see if we can get a little more into the creative aspect, our compositions and such. What are we talking about with just compositional ideas? What do you got in mind there for us?
Well, the first off is the moon's round. Even like when it's a crescent, like I said, your brain wants to fill in that circle.
Sure.
And it kind of thinks of it as a circular object. And so you're going to have a round object against a landscape which may have relief, it may have lines, it may have leading lines. You're generally going to have a horizon involved because you're trying to photograph something past the horizon if you're down near the horizon as you're photographing it. So definitely think about ways that you can play with the natural landscape. Like I said, I like to shoot the moon rising next to mountains a lot. Mount Hood's one of my favorites since it's so close. Hood's a very triangular looking mountain. So, I try to take photos of the moon as it like skims up one side of the mountain or even just aligns with the top of the mountain. Sometimes I'll shoot it coming out the side because you can't always end up getting the moon to come up exactly where you want every month. And buildings, they're another cool thing to use as a foreground object with the moon. One thing to think about is when you're using telephoto lenses, you can make objects in the foreground increase in size by moving back and forth with your location. Actually, with any lens, doesn't matter what focal length of lens you have. But merely moving closer and further away from a foreground object will make that object appear bigger. The moon, relative to the motion that you moved, it's not going to change in size. So the moon's always going to be about the same size for a certain focal length lens, but you can change the size of the foreground relative to the moon by not only your position left and right, but forward and backwards as you get closer and further away from the moon. So that's something you can use to your benefit. And PhotoPills has a really good tutorial on how to get the moon to be the same size as an object in the foreground.
Yes, I saw that.
They call it a...
That just bent my mind when I saw that.
Yeah, it's kind of cool, and it's awesome that it's such a simple thing, too. They call it the rule of 100. They call it the PhotoPills rule of 100. And so if you have an object that's, say, 10 feet across, you need to be 100 feet away from it to get it to appear the same size as the moon.
Interesting.
And, 100 times 10. You need to be 1,000 feet away from it to get it to appear the same size as the moon.
Wow.
So if you're trying to get your model to be the same size as the moon, your 6-foot model, you need to be 600 feet away from the moon.
Huh.
So it works with any foreground object. If you know the dimension of that object, multiply it by 100. Works in meters, works in feet, works in miles. Just move back that distance and it'll be the same relative size as the moon. Huh. And that works with the sun as well. The sun's almost the same size, like we were saying with the eclipses.
Man, yeah, my mind is just racing now with because we're trying to think composition here. Of course, we're trying to think about envisioning what could we do, what are the possibilities. So maybe we've got we've got a listener who's in a big city and you've got an arrangement of bridges. Well, I think of you in Portland. You've got plenty of bridges in Portland.
Right.
Maybe we've got someone who's out in the wilderness. Wherever you're at, you're going to be able to take this idea and say, okay, I want the moon to be a prominent figure in my scene. So first off, if there's anything on the ground that you want the moon to be a prominent figure for, i.e. physically large comparatively to it, certainly you're going to need to be thinking about shooting near moonrise, moonset, whether it's crescent, whether it's waxing, whatever. Mm-hmm. You're going to need it close, physically to the earth so that you can frame it up that way. But then we can play with the interaction of those objects and the interaction of the moon with those objects. I really like the idea of being able to easily configure that and just say, hey, I need to back up and then put on my really long lens and zoom right way in. And then all of a sudden this building or this window on a building or whatever it might be, this person standing on the edge of a cliff, all of these things that could be possible compositional ideas. All of a sudden we're thinking, oh, hey, here's some opportunities. Here's an idea of how we can make that a little more dynamic as it relates to, okay, we're going to make that moon feel really big. We're going to make the person feel really small comparatively. Yeah, there's just a lot of things that just can expand the mind as it relates to trying to think, how are we going to do this? How are we going to set this up and make this happen? That's really cool.
Yeah. Another thing to think about is because crescent and quarter moons have kind of a shape where one side is brighter than the other side, there's kind of an implied line that's pointing away from them that you can use and line it up with an object in the foreground. So that's one thing that I always try to think about is like towers or, buildings, getting the moon off to one side of the frame, let's say rule of thirds, everyone's favorite photography rule. You put the crescent moon up in the upper right third intersection, and then like your building or mountain or whatever in your lower, or I got it backwards, upper left, lower right, or do it the other way around, upper right, lower left, but kind of have a diagonal implied in there and align it. Also do that with full moons. I'll set them up that way a lot, but sometimes, like especially with crescent moons and the earth shine, that's like the main thing that I usually try to capture is the earth shine on a crescent. And so I'll use like a long telephoto lens, and I don't really care about the what's on the ground so much, because that interest of the earth shine is what I'm trying to capture. But sometimes I'll include just a little strip of land on the bottom edge of the frame. I mean, it's much more than like a rule of third or a rule of fourth or fifth down on the edge of the frame. It's just a little strip to kind of just anchor the image back to the earth so that the viewer knows it's not something that's happening way up in the sky. It's something that's happening right near the horizon. And so that's another composition that I like to do for crescent moons.
Very cool. Yeah, I think that certainly when we're starting out, or even when we're not starting out, this is for everybody, trying to do what we can to simplify it and to get it boiled down is always going to be a goal that I'm going to recommend people do. But sometimes you just have things that are more complex. And so we have to then introduce more complex ideas beyond, let's say, rule of thirds. And that's where I'm just going to talk super briefly and just say, I want people to get into photographers be in a mindset that says, look, if I don't have the rule of thirds available to me because it's just not lining up, things just aren't going to be magically placed, kind of like you said there. I mean, if we can do that, by all means, we should do that. I think it's amazing. But if we don't have that available, let's not get immediately discouraged and say, oh, the photo's not working. What I would encourage photographers to look at is to say, okay, what else do I have? And do I have this notion of texture? Do I have other leading lines, shapes? What's my hierarchy in the scene? All these different things helps us to come into a composition that I'm trying to think who it was. I think it was Milton Glaser, who's a famed designer from the 60s and 70s. I could be getting this wrong. I could be misattributing it to someone. But anyway, he said the composition is just the strongest way of seeing. And so when we're looking at the scene, that's our job, is to figure out what's the strongest way to portray what we have before us. And if you don't have the rule of thirds available to you with the arrangement of your things, I would just say keep looking, because these other design principles there's always going to be something there, and maybe you can use some of those to inform how you're going to ultimately compose this scene, and just open yourself to that. And if you're not sure what those are, I just listed off a whole bunch of them. Certainly there's more, but I like to think about contrast is a huge one, and not just contrast in tones or luminance values, contrast in everything.
Yeah.
And then we're going to be looking at those notions of leading lines. We're going to be thinking about framing elements, all sorts of things that you can look at as basic design principles that are going to help you establish the right solution for the subject at hand. In this case, your moon and whatever else you got going on in your scene.
Yeah, and back to rules. A solitary moon up in the sky, centering it in the middle of the frame is probably the most natural thing to do with a shot like that. Or if you're on a flat horizon, maybe having the horizon split straight in the middle with the moon coming up right in the center of the frame, that could work out really good too. You just got to play with what you have in front of you and see what's going to make a compelling photograph.
Exactly. Because maybe that horizon that's split in the middle, maybe you've got some kind of field of grass or whatever, and the wind is actually blowing. That's going to create its whole new, different sense of interest that you can balance off with the moon. Maybe it's, we don't know what you got in front of you, but whatever it is you have in front of you, that is going to have to feed into your decision-making process. That's about that's what it boils down to.
Yeah. So, some tips for shooting. Probably the most important thing, especially with long lenses, is keep your camera from not shaking. So, like we mentioned earlier, you want to have a stable tripod, which usually means not a super lightweight travel tripod with a giant, lens.
And 6 different leg sections that just wobble, wobble, wobble.
Exactly. I limit myself to either 2 or 3 sections on my tripod legs.
Yeah.
And also put your camera on solid ground if you can. Some soils are not as solid as other soils, or even if you're shooting in sand, press that tripod down into the sand and get it buried in there.
The thing I hate, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, tripod spikes can help get the feet down in there a little further sometimes too.
For sure. One of the things I hate, because I love your next one, mossy ground.
Yeah.
Where it's like a sponge.
Oh, for sure.
And your next one that's on the list here is be careful about how where you stand, how you walk, how you tread about your tripod feet, because you're just shifting your weight can shift, of course, your tripod. Well, even if you're on sand on the beach, it can happen too. But having been up several months ago now, but having gone to Southeast Alaska, just about anywhere here in the Pacific Northwest, you just have a good chance that your ground is going to be mossy, and that means it's like a sponge, and it just is not going to be solid unless you dig your tripod legs, your feet down there. And that's definitely a good tip for trying to make sure. Let's make sure we have a good solid approach. You could have the heaviest tripod available, but if you don't got solid ground, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and especially with how light cameras are nowadays. And tripods too. 3-pound tripod is kind of common these days for a lot of things. So, another thing you can do is they make rock bags or sandbags that you can strap to the yoke of your tripod and add some weight to them. You can also add weight to your camera. I went to the local fitness store and I bought a set of ankle weights that were 5 pounds per ankle. I pulled out half of the weight, so I only have about 2.5 pounds. And when I'm shooting with the 2 to 600 millimeter lens, I'll actually put both of those on each end of the lens. So one's down near the camera body, one's up near the lens hood. And the idea there is to add more mass to the camera so that when the wind comes, or if you're walking on the ground or something, it'll keep the camera still and keep it from moving. It'll give some resistance to any breezes that come along.
I like that. Yeah, it's a good idea. And I hadn't thought of that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Another thing you can do is you can use a lens support. There's a couple of kinds. Like if you have a lens with a foot on it, you can get a lens support that will connect to the foot and then back to your L bracket on your camera, and then connect that to the tripod. Or there's another kind that actually has like a couple little wheels in the front of the bracket that will rest up in the front of the lens. So you connect it to your L bracket.
Yeah, I've seen those too.
And then you support the lens with a little slidable support. And then you connect that to your tripod.
Yeah.
If you really want to go for it, you can buy extension legs that'll go from your tripod leg up to the front of your lens support and add a little triangulation to the front of your tripod. I haven't used one of those yet. It seems like it's going to be a pain in the butt to make some fine adjustments.
Yeah, that's what I'm concerned about. Yeah.
Yeah. So I haven't taken that step, but that is one option. If you're not going to be moving your camera, it could be a great thing to do. The shutter release, that's almost a necessary item for shooting with a super long lens. So
absolutely. I don't even like using the 2-second exposure on a super long lens.
Yeah.
In this case, because just the act of tapping that button and then you release it, there's still too much chance that it's going to have some residual shake.
Yeah.
And you just, get yourself a cable or some kind of remote release for that. And then if you're a DSLR shooter, lock up that mirror. Oh,
yeah. That's another good one. Definitely do that. And if you're a mirrorless person, you could even use electronic front shutter curtains. So
there you go.
The camera doesn't even move before it takes the start of the exposure.
Yeah, so the shutter itself is already open, and it doesn't have to close it and go with its mechanical shutter.
Yeah.
That can definitely help you in the stability idea of keeping your overall rig stable.
Yeah. So we're coming down to the final stretch here. I got a couple ideas on how to come up with your exposures for different times of the day. So if you're shooting the moon with the landscape, and it's still daytime hours, just use whatever exposure you would probably use for a normal daytime scene.
Sure.
If you're with a longer telephoto, you're going to need to have a shorter shutter speed to control the motion of the moon. Go ahead and use your camera's meter and look at your histogram and make sure that everything's looking good. If it's after sunset, make use of your histogram and those blinkies like we were talking about to make sure you're not getting the exposure of the moon too bright. If you need, go ahead and underexposure the exposure a little bit.
Right.
Go and practice shooting something that's a little brighter than the rest of the scene, and bracket up and down and see just how far you can overexpose and pull something back down. You know, playing with your camera like this can actually help you out in the field later on. If you're shooting more than about 30 minutes after sunset, the moon is going to be definitely getting brighter than the landscape with natural lighting. In the city, it may be coming into balance to where the moon's going to work with some brighter city lights, but if you're out in the natural landscape, you're really starting to push the boundaries of what you can do as far as a landscape photo. So you can either let the moon and the landscape fall where they happen to fall, or you can, and I would say probably if you want detail on the moon, bias it towards the moon. If you're wanting detail in the foreground, go ahead and bias it towards the foreground. Or you can kind of combine both of those into a composite or HDR photo. But, you got to be careful because it's really easy to make your photos look fake if you're combining a moon with a really dark foreground. And there's just all this detail on the moon. I'm sure you've all seen lots of social media photos like that.
Man.
That just look cut and paste.
And don't be tempted to add 2 or 3 times the size of the moon in your shot either. I mean,
definitely. That's the other thing is, a lot of times some people will take a landscape, turn the camera around and shoot the moon up in the sky from the other direction. And people that study pictures of the moon, they can see that the light just doesn't match the direction on the moon versus the direction on the ground. So, if you think you're pulling a fast one on people, there's going to be those people out there that are just going to spot it in a half a second.
Just this last week, we weren't looking at moon images, but just this last week in my intro to digital imaging class at the university, we were talking about this kind of stuff, and I had I have them do some research and bring in some digital imaging type stuffs, and we put it up there on screen. And those that have either different angle light, but it's close, but it's just not right, or their shadows are inconsistent, or just whatever. Again, it's close, but look at it, and we're just asking the students, what's wrong with this image? They're just like, what do you mean what's wrong? And then I start pointing a few things out, and all of a sudden they can just pick out everything.
Yeah.
And it's just like, yes, now you know what to look for, not only in determining what is potentially a photoshopped image, but when you're photoshopping your images, what the pitfalls are, and if your intent is to make it look legit, make it look legit. That's your job. But anyway, I digress.
No, that's a good point. So if you're going to fake it, know how to fake it.
That's right.
So
we haven't even talked about any of this fancy dancy AI stuff that's coming out. So my goodness, that would be the easier way to fake it, I guess.
No, I don't know. I don't know how much the computers understand this stuff yet.
Maybe not. Yeah, I don't know.
It'll happen someday, but at this point, I don't think it's quite there yet. So So once the moon gets up in the sky, like higher than 15 or 20 degrees, you can start doing your exposures for the moon with the Looney 11 rule. It's definitely going to be the brightest thing in the sky when it's at nighttime. And like we had said, make adjustments as needed. Check your histogram. Don't trust your LCD. It's easy to get off with that. Another thing to consider is the atmosphere is going to have a big effect on the moon, especially when it's down low on the horizon. The moon can look so orange when it's like right on the horizon. It's also actually about 4 or 5 stops dimmer when it's that low on the horizon versus when it's up in the sky. It's going to get brighter really quick as it starts to rise, or it gets dimmer as it starts to set. And things like smoke and haze and humidity are all going to decrease the brightness of the moon. So you just kind of got to look at your local conditions and check your histogram and, adjust as needed. Then, like we mentioned, stop your lens down for sharpness. And if you need to get a little more brightness in the exposure, go ahead and use your ISO to raise it up. So, and then tracking, like we talked about, a lot of times you can just use the Looney 11 rule and set your camera up on a tracker, take the picture of the moon, and it's going to be an awesome exposure for it. So the only thing to think about is that Looney 11 is for a full moon. As the moon gets smaller, it gets dimmer. So it's about a half a stop dimmer as a quarter, and like another stop dimmer as a crescent. So you'll need to add a little more exposure for those as the moon gets smaller and smaller. And especially if you're trying to get the earth shine, you're going to add like 4 or 5 stops of exposure for the earth shine over what even adjusting the Looney 11 rule is going to give you. But, well, that's about all I've got today. So,
well, it has certainly been a great learning experience as we're thinking about heading out and photographing the moon. So thank you, Kirk. This has been amazing.
Sure. thanks for having me on too. And your listeners might be interested in knowing that I'm going to be doing a photographing the moon workshop with a friend of mine. His name is Brian Chambers. He's lives in Hood River. He's a professional photographer. I'm a part-time photographer, and have a day
now.
Job
Where are you
still.
guys going to be doing this thing?
It's going to be in Portland on April 5th of this year, 2023. And for more information, go to Brian's website, and that's brianchambersphotography.net.
All right.
Spelled just like you think it is, Brian Chambers with an S on Chambers. Photography. No spaces, no dashes.
All right. And we'll make sure to have a link in the show notes, both for your app where you can quickly access it here as you're listening to it. But if you've clicked on through to the website, we'll make sure to have it prominently listed there as well, so you can easily find that information there.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And we're also doing a Zoom class in a week, which is going to be February 5th, which I think is going to come out after, or the podcast will come out after that.
It'll be in the neighborhood or shortly after, yeah.
Yeah. I think that'll still be available to view online if you get in contact with Brian.
Okay.
And that's going to be on using Planet Pro for photographers. Ooh. And we're going to look at some shots that I've taken using Planet of the moon and getting the moon in compositions exactly how you want them before you even ever get out in the field to go take the photographs. So
nice. Well, that sounds amazing. That's definitely something, both Planet and photo pills. I have them on my phone, and it's just like I need to dive more into it, because the next time that I want to do something a little more serious, I don't want to be figuring it out on the fly,
Oh, for sure.
But it's all about one of those, to have a thing like this to where someone can have it. Just here's your step by step. That could be really cool. So hopefully, as you're listening to this, hopefully this is something that'll interest you. And here's a great solution for getting some of these apps figured out, so you can be super, what I'm going to call efficient with your image making process and your creative process as you're trying to make up these compositional decisions and come out with solutions for what you got going on in your neck of the woods.
Yeah. And we keep talking about it, but if we ever meet up, I'll give you that crash course on Planet while we're sitting around.
Yes, absolutely. We're only a couple 100 miles away, Kirk.
I think it is like 200 miles. So
actually, you said that thing is April 5th.
April 5th, yeah.
We will be in town April 2.
Okay.
Now, it's for a memorial service, so I'm probably not going to be able to get away.
You should probably concentrate on that.
Nor will I want to. But anyway, we'll be super in the super close in the proximity. So anyway, if something happens, I'll certainly let you know.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, Brent.
You bet. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to having you on again next time. As we were talking, I don't know how much you feel comfortable doing this, but I would love a conversation on the tides.
Oh, yeah.
Wouldn't that be cool?
It would be.
To understand the tides and just think a little more about that, because they're controlled by the moon.
Yeah.
And as we're out there on the Oregon coast or wherever else, that could be a really interesting thing to just be a little more knowledgeable about tides. So anyway, whether I do the research or if you already have the knowledge and you can wax eloquence on tides and all that other stuff, boy, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, well, actually, Planet has a calculator for tide tables in it. So
nice.
It's super handy. I use it every time I go to the beach.
Sweet. Very cool. All right. Well, until next time, Kirk, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep. What a conversation. Boy, it is. It's so hard to put into words how amazing this region of this fantastic earth is that we live on. And Oman, I just did not expect any of these things. And it was just really cool. That's just awesome. Just a quick reminder again that BC LatPod15 is the discount code for Breathing Color. So that's breathingcolor.com. Got fantastic fine art papers, photo papers, canvases. Now, I personally have not done any of the canvases yet. There's a fellow in town, his entire job, his entire work is doing fine art reproductions for various artists in town. And he uses some Breathing Color material. And so he actually gave me some. He gave me almost a full roll of their live canvas, LYVE, and then another half roll, and then just a whole smattering of other things. Not some more from Breathing Color and some more from some other stuff. So whatever. Just some random stuff that he was not going to be using anymore. Because mostly because the rolls were just too short and it wasn't worth it for him to keep around. And so I'll be playing with that stuff too, and especially that canvas. Looking very much forward to that canvas. But if you'd like to try the products yourself, BC LatPod15, and you just have a couple more days from the time that this is published. So if we're a few more days in the future, I'm sorry it didn't work out as far as receiving the opportunity to use that discount code. Time got away from me, and I apologize for that. All right, let's get on to a little bit of our dose of inspiration. And I chose something here from Isaiah 43:19, and it says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." And that's the English Standard Version. I just had to choose this one because it talked about the rivers in the desert, and that's what Nickolas was talking about. We had these canyons that he's been able to get into. He was going to do a lot more canyoneering, but of course he broke his toe while he was over there. So he got at least into one of these canyons, and that was just awesome to talk about, to see those images. Certainly take a look at the Facebook group. So do a quick search in Facebook if you're not a part of the group, where you can go just search up Great Outdoors Photography Podcast. Ask to join the group if you're not a part of the group, and you will have to answer a few questions. So make sure that you answer those questions. I won't let you in unless there's some evidence there that's going to make sense to let you in, and answering those questions is the way to do that. All right. So a couple other quotes. I like to get some additional quotes, and I couldn't settle on just one, but these next three actually come from my favorite author, Paul Theroux. And he's a travel writer. Now, he also has done some fiction work. I read one, maybe two actually, of his fiction pieces. Didn't really care for it. It wasn't my cup of tea, so to speak. But his travel writing is absolutely the best. And so here's a couple from him. "You go away for a long time and return a different person. You never come all the way back." I know for sure that this is absolutely true. The longer away that you are gone from home, the more you change. Travel just changes you. Going out even one time to shoot a little bit, there's a little tiny bit of a change that you have. There's a little change that you experience. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's definitely a good thing. And the more you do it, within reason, I suppose, the better off you are. But you never come all the way back. I think that's just true because you're a different person. So you just never come all the way back to the same person that you were. All right, another quote that he's got. I love this one. "Tourists don't know where they've been. Travelers don't know where they're going." This is something I know for myself. It's not exactly true because I am used to doing some research. I'm used to doing some things to figure stuff out. But I still like to call myself a traveler. And for sure, tourists don't know where they've been. That's because you tend to have a whirlwind approach. You look at things, and the memories that you have tend to be a little more of a blur. And I know for myself, I would much rather have a slower experience, a slowed down, get a little more, where possible, as much as possible, get authentic with your travel, get authentic with your experiences with wherever you're going. And when you can do that, And in the case of what Theroux is saying here, you don't know where you're going. That part tells me that you're just all about this idea of exploration. You're about discovery and you're about curiosity. And those are the things for me that photography is about, that travel is about. That's what life is about. Without these things in my life, I know I get really bored really quick. I get really fed up with things. And to be able to have this notion of discovering something new, creating something new and useful, that really just fires it all off for me. Those types of things are what give life value, and what give. It just makes it all better. All right, this last one also from Theroux. Travel is glorious only in retrospect. I know you can agree, at least with some of this idea as well. Travel is glorious only in retrospect. I think there's a romance. So travel is romantic when we anticipate travel. Certainly what he's getting at here too is the experience of travel is just something that, well, it can be kind of annoying. It's probably at least one way to put it. Another one he has here, I'm just looking on the website that I got this from. Travel is flight and pursuit in equal parts. Where you're running from something and you're pursuing something in equal parts. He's also talked about in some other times. I've read, I think, just about every one of his travel books. So I'm trying to, think of the ones that I've already read too. And that is, it's just a bunch of waiting. Travel can be, you're just stuck in line, whether you're trying to get the passport stamp, whether you're trying to pass through customs, whether you're at the bus station, whatever it is. The actual act of travel is not something that is always hugely exciting. But then definitely it seems and it feels glorious in retrospect for sure. And I would add what I've already said before here, the idea that there's a certain romance to it. It's just like, we pine for it. We want to have it happen. And we're trying to always think about how can we make it happen and stuff like that. So hopefully this conversation I had with Nickolas is making you get a little bit energized and a little bit curious about our world. Maybe you're not going to go to Oman and you're not going to camp out in the desert and hike until you can't see the car anymore or things like that. Whatever it is that this inspires you to do, though, hopefully you're inspired to go experience something new with our world, experience it with your camera, and certainly take some pictures. That would just create something that is not only going to serve as a memory for you, as something to remember your experience by, but something that gives you a personal commentary on where you've been, and it can help you tell the story of that place. And it will help it become more glamorous in retrospect because you have these amazing images to share with friends and family and a whole bunch of other people, hopefully. All right, that's going to wrap it up for me right now. And as I'm looking forward on the schedule of things, there's a couple more ideas I have certainly about this notion of taking a look at photographing, whether it's here on the farm or just other things that are going to be a little more local in the idea of what we're going to be, just trying to give you a glimpse into the future, as it were. Got a few more interview ideas that I'm trying to line up too. So those things will just all come out. Stay tuned as we look forward to a few more items here in the next month or so. And we keep thinking about, where are we going to shoot? What are we going to do? And again, I want you to hopefully be inspired by these things. And if you've got something to share from these things, by all means, share them in the Facebook group. That would be amazing. Share this episode or a few other episodes in the back catalog with a friend. That would be so awesome to have you do, for you to help expand the reach of what we're talking about here and help expand the understanding and help expand the experience that we all can have with our photography, whether it's through inspiration, whether it's through encouragement, and just getting out there and making more great images of our fine, wonderful planet in the great outdoors. All right, until next time, God bless and happy shooting.